Let's stay with that story. And Dr. Rashawn Ray is a fellow at the Brookings Institution and a professor at the University of Maryland. His research focuses on racial inequality and police reform, and he's with me now. Professor Ray, thank you very much for being with us this hour. Let me ask you, first of all, about exactly that question, policing reform. The aspiration was to get it signed into law today. It's not going to happen because it's held up in the Senate. How important is police reform to this question of changing the racial perspective of the justice system?
Well, thank you for having me on. I mean, it's essential. I mean, when we start talking about police reform, it is the crutch of how we oftentimes think about race relations in the United States. And make no mistake, the Democrats realize that they have to be able to include qualified immunity if there's going to be real change. There's a lot of pushback on the Republican side, but we can't simply just think about reform. What we really have to think about is transformation and reimagining. And part of that includes not just addressing the systemic ways that racism plays out in policing, but also to affect the culture of policing in the United States.
Now, let's deal with that question you raised of qualified immunity. How does that work, and how does that impede, in your view, the kind of reform agenda?
So qualified immunity in the United States is a court doctrine that essentially prevents police officers and other government officials from facing any sort of financial liability. So in the United States, what that means is that the $27 million awarded to George Floyd's family, or the $12 million awarded to Breonna Taylor's family in Louisville, Kentucky, that money primarily comes from taxpayers. Police officers are completely absolved from facing that financial penalty, as well as police departments. And what the public wants to see, over 60% of Americans, in fact, and roughly 40% of Republicans actually want to see qualified immunity addressed so that police officers can start to take some of the financial burden, and hopefully that changes some of their behavior.
That's a really interesting example, because in a sense you're capturing through legislation at that time the kind of resentment that people sometimes feel when public officials don't do their job, and then, as you say, it's the taxpayer that ends up having to pay the millions of dollars in damages and all the rest of it. In this situation, nobody wants there to be the victims in the first place, but you think kind of changing that kind of working almost with the kind of grain of public opinion, building a broader coalition behind reform might be one way to put some pressure on the politicians on Capitol Hill to get this legislation through?
I think so. I mean, look, change oftentimes comes to Washington, D.C. It doesn't start with Washington, D.C. So that public pressure has definitely mounted. And Democrats and Republicans know they have to get something done. Democrats are behind the eight ball here. They didn't make the one-year mark, and people want to see qualified immunity included, in addition to the other provisions like banning no-knock warrants, banning chokeholds, ensuring body-worn cameras and implicit bias trainings, creating some federal databases. But qualified immunity is definitely key here.
The Senate did approve just Tuesday, actually, a few hours after we're speaking, the confirmation of Kristen Clarke to lead the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department. It's got two investigations, one on Minneapolis, of course, and also Louisville as well, under consideration by the departments, Louisville being where Breonna Taylor was killed in her own home. Is that good news? I mean, A, because the Senate have managed to get this agreement, and B, because of the person she is, do you think?
I think most definitely. Look, Kristen Clarke is simply amazing at what she's done. Her track record speaks for itself. Part of the reason why it's relevant to thinking about policing is obviously she's going to be controlling the Civil Rights Division, the first Black woman to be in that role, long overdue. But part of thinking about this is that the Department of Justice oftentimes hands down what are called consent decrees. These are federal investigations of police departments when they have done things egregious, like discrimination within the police department or use of force to someone. This is the reason why Minneapolis and Louisville are on the table here. What's important to note is that under Donald Trump, there were 0 consent decrees. There were many under President Obama. There were several under President Bush before him. And part of that record, I think, is one of the reasons why we are here. So the Department of Justice has a lot of work, not just involving use of force and police brutality and misconduct, but also racial discrimination among police officers within a department. I think Kristen Clarke is primed for the task.
Professor Rashawn Ray, real pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much for giving us your time and your analysis on this, the first anniversary of the killing of George Floyd. Thank you.